March 1945. The Eastern German city of Dessau was no longer a place of life, but a graveyard waiting to be named. Buildings had collapsed like dominoes, churches were hollow shells, and the streets were lined with rubble and silence. The war had not ended yet, but hope already had. Somewhere beneath the surface of what used to be a family home, Elsa Berger sat in a cold basement with her 3 children, surrounded by damp stone and broken furniture that no longer served a purpose.
Elsa had not seen the sky in days. Every creak above made her freeze, unsure whether it was a shell, a soldier, or just the groaning of a dying building. Her youngest, 4-year-old Kurt, lay curled in her lap, his face pale and sunken. He no longer cried, because tears required water, and thirst was a luxury they couldn't afford. Next to him, 10-year-old Paul rested his head on a folded coat, his eyes half closed, murmuring nonsense in his sleep. 12-year-old Helga sat close to the door, trying to pretend she wasn't afraid. She used to help cook meals, go to school, and sing with her classmates. Now she spent her days guarding silence, listening for death on the other side of the wall. Elsa watched her daughter and felt a quiet grief. Children were never meant to carry that kind of silence inside them. The basement was filled with a staleness that didn't just come from lack of air. It came from despair that lingered in every corner. The small room next to theirs held a wrapped bundle, once a neighbor, now just a body. She had starved 2 weeks ago. Elsa had tried to cover her out of respect, but no one came to help bury her. There were no more burials, only waiting. Food was gone. The last scraps of dried potatoes had been boiled into a watery soup 4 days earlier. Elsa had rationed the bread crusts, saving the last one for Kurt, who had begun to hallucinate. He had asked for his father that morning, asked when Papa would come home from Russia. Elsa hadn't told him that his father had died 2 years ago, shot in the back for desertion on the Eastern Front. The radio had stopped working weeks ago, but its last words had lingered in Elsa's mind. It spoke of victory, of sacrifice, of enemies who would show no mercy. But she had stopped believing those voices when she watched her neighbors disappear into trucks and never return. Now the silence spoke louder. It said, "Be still, be invisible, survive." No neighbors came anymore. The streets above had been abandoned or destroyed. Most of the men were dead or at the front. Those who remained, old women, mothers, children, hid in their own cellars like ghosts. No one dared to knock on doors or ask for help. Even compassion had retreated underground, afraid of being seen as weakness. Elsa clung to routine like a life raft. Every morning she checked the ceiling for new cracks, gathered the children close, whispered a prayer she no longer believed in. She cleaned the same patch of floor again and again, not because it needed cleaning, but because it was something to do. Every movement reminded her she was still alive, even if only barely. And yet, despite everything, the cold, the hunger, the death all around, her children still breathed. That simple fact was her last possession. They hadn't been taken yet. And as long as they were still breathing in that dark corner of the world, Elsa refused to let herself die with the rest of it. They arrived not with fire, but with engines. The first rumble came early in the morning, low and steady, like a distant thunderstorm that refused to fade. Elsa held her breath as the sound grew louder, vibrating through the cracked walls of the basement. Her children sat frozen around her, their eyes wide, listening for what would follow. It was not the scream of bombs this time, but the steady clatter of armored tracks. Through a small slit near the basement ceiling, Helga was the first to see them.
She whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. Americans. The vehicles rolled past slowly, cautiously, their green hulls splattered with mud and soot. Soldiers sat with rifles slung across their chests, helmets tilted back, faces unreadable. They were not the monsters the radio had described. Elsa's heart pounded with confusion. She expected shouting, gunfire, looting. Instead, the column moved with eerie calm, as if they were not invading, but inheriting ruins. One of the soldiers stopped briefly to examine a collapsed wall, then moved on. There was no violence, no cruelty, just tired men in foreign uniforms walking through a dead city. That first day, the Americans didn't enter the basements. They set up camp near the town square, where the ruins were open enough to see in all directions. Smoke from small fires curled into the cold air. From their hiding place, Elsa and her children could smell something strange, savory and rich, like real food cooking. Paul's stomach growled so loudly she had to shush him. Elsa knew they could not stay hidden forever. Food was gone, and the children were weakening. But fear clung to her like a second skin. She remembered the speeches, the warnings, the posters that showed Americans with fangs and blood-stained hands. Could they be trusted? Could anyone? Later that afternoon, she watched through the crack in the wall as an elderly woman approached the camp. Bent with age, holding a bucket, she shuffled toward the soldiers. Elsa held her breath, waiting for gunfire, but none came. Instead, a soldier took the bucket and helped her fill it from a water tank. When she turned to leave, he offered her a can of something. She bowed her head and walked away. Kurt, watching from Elsa's lap, asked if that meant the war was over. She didn't know what to say. Peace was a word that no longer meant anything. War had taken so much already that even its end felt hollow. But something inside her stirred. Not hope exactly, but a question she couldn't silence. What if these men were different? That night, they heard singing. Soft, unfamiliar songs floated in from the distance, male voices harmonizing around a campfire. Elsa hadn't heard music in months. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and remembered dancing in the kitchen before the war, holding her husband's hand as the radio played. That memory hit her like a blade. The next morning, the soldiers began walking the streets. Two of them passed within feet of the basement entrance. Elsa froze as one of them paused, looked toward the building, then moved on. His face was young, barely more than a boy. His eyes weren't cruel, just tired. Helga whispered that they didn't look like enemies. Elsa said nothing. She couldn't trust what she saw, not yet. But the truth was beginning to press against the edges of her fear. These men carried weapons, but they hadn't used them. They cooked meals, they gave water, and they didn't knock on doors. Still, Elsa kept her children inside. Silence had kept them alive this long. But she also began listening more closely, to the footsteps above, to the voices outside, to the smell of warm food that drifted through the cracks. The enemy had arrived, and yet nothing terrible had happened. That alone was a surprise. And sometimes, in war, surprise was the first step toward something unthinkable: change. On the third day of occupation, everything shifted. The sound of boots on gravel had become normal, and the occasional rumble of trucks barely made the children flinch. Elsa still kept her family hidden in the basement, but she began to spend more time near the small window, watching. Something in the Americans' movements seemed less threatening now. They weren't searching for enemies. They were building something that looked like routine. That morning, two soldiers stopped near the building and spoke briefly. One of them carried a wooden crate, and the other pointed toward the row of basements. They left the crate at the edge of the alley and walked away. Elsa waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. When no one returned, she climbed the stairs cautiously, heart pounding with every step. The crate was real. Inside were cans of beans, a tin of fruit preserves, several packages of hardtack, and a loaf of something miraculous, soft, white bread. Elsa stared at it in disbelief. She reached in and touched it, half expecting it to vanish. Her fingers trembled. It had been so long since she had touched anything, so fresh, so soft, so alive. She brought it back downstairs and set it before the children as though it were an altar. Paul's eyes widened, and Helga covered her mouth, stunned. Kurt reached forward, uncertain, as if he thought it might be poisoned. Elsa tore off a small piece and tasted it first. The flavor made her close her eyes. It was simple bread, but it tasted like a miracle. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. Elsa rationed the food as best she could, making the small meal last as long as possible. Even Kurt, usually the first to devour everything, waited before asking for more. It was not greed they felt, but awe. Food from strangers, from enemies, and not as a demand, not in exchange for anything, just given. That evening, more crates appeared in the alley. This time they contained blankets, soap, and powdered milk. Elsa took them and whispered a quiet thank you to the empty air. No soldier ever entered the basement. No one asked who she was or what she had done. They simply left supplies and walked away. The next day, an old woman from the neighborhood approached one of the soldiers with a cane and broken English. He listened, nodded, and handed her a sealed package before helping her back to her steps. Elsa watched the scene unfold and realized that fear was starting to erode, not just inside her, but throughout the street. Paul began to ask questions again. Could they go outside? Were the soldiers going to stay? Would there be more food? Elsa didn't know how to answer. Her instincts still screamed caution, but something else, something older than war, told her that it was time to see the world again. Late that afternoon, Helga convinced Elsa to let her peek out beyond the ruins. They climbed the steps together, hand in hand, until they reached the doorway. Across the street, a group of soldiers sat around a fire, laughing softly, passing around a pot of something that smelled like stew. One of them noticed them and smiled. He didn't wave. He just nodded, as if to say, "We see you, and it's okay." Elsa pulled Helga back gently and closed the door. Her heart raced, but not from fear. Something was changing, not just outside, but inside her. It had started with a loaf of bread, and now, for the first time in months, she felt the distant outline of trust, not fully formed, but real. It was Kurt who crossed the invisible line first. One morning, as Elsa boiled water over a small fire near the cellar door, she turned around to find him gone. Panic surged through her as she rushed up the stairs and spotted him across the courtyard. He was standing, motionless, just a few feet from a group of American soldiers gathered around a makeshift cooking station. In his hands, he clutched an empty tin cup, held out with silent hope. The soldiers reacted slowly, as if unsure what they were seeing. One of them, a tall man with a kind face and sun-reddened skin, lowered his spoon and stood. He said something Elsa couldn't hear, then walked toward Kurt with measured steps. The boy didn't flinch. He simply held out the cup, eyes fixed on the pot behind them. The soldier knelt, took the cup gently, and filled it with steaming stew. Elsa wanted to scream for him to come back, but she held her breath. Kurt accepted the food, looked up at the man, and whispered something too soft to carry. Then he turned and walked back toward the basement, his small hands shaking from more than just the cold. Elsa opened the door and pulled him inside, checking every inch of him as if he'd crossed through fire. He just smiled and said, "They're not bad."
Later that day, Paul and Helga asked if they could go too. Elsa said no at first, but her protest was weak. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, she climbed to the top step and sat in the shadows, watching the Americans from a distance. One of them played music on a harmonica. Another shared something from a red box. Small rectangles passed from hand to hand. She realized it was chocolate. The next morning, Helga left a small flower near the soldiers' fire. She didn't speak or linger, just placed it on a rock and walked away. In the afternoon, when they returned, someone had placed a folded cloth napkin in the same spot, holding a piece of hard candy and a note that read simply, "For the girl with the flower." Elsa couldn't deny what was happening. Her children were building bridges without asking permission. They didn't carry the same burden of propaganda or trauma. They just knew hunger, and now they were learning kindness. That scared her more than anything, because it meant hope was returning, and hope was dangerous in a world like this. Still, the pattern continued. Each day, the children ventured a bit farther. They returned with stories of quiet gestures, a soldier who gave Paul a piece of cornbread, another who taught Helga a few words in English. The Americans never pushed, never demanded anything. They were simply present. It confused Elsa, and it softened her. One afternoon, Elsa finally stepped outside herself. She didn't approach the soldiers, didn't speak, but she stood near the door as Kurt handed a soldier a drawing he had made with charcoal on torn paper. The man looked at it, smiled, and tapped his chest, then pointed to Kurt. Gratitude without words. Elsa watched it unfold and felt something melt inside her. Later, while folding the donated blankets, she found a note tucked inside. It read, in careful German, "We were told you would hate us. We were wrong." The words hit her like a confession. She sat on the floor and cried, not from grief, but from the overwhelming weight of feeling safe for the first time in years. The next day, one of the soldiers brought a camera and offered to take a picture. Paul stood beside Helga, holding Kurt's hand. Elsa didn't join. She watched from the shadows as the shutter clicked, freezing a moment of impossible peace in a war that had stolen everything else. It was a small thing, but small things mattered now more than ever. At night, Elsa lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her stomach no longer ached with hunger, but with uncertainty. What would come next? Could this last? She didn't know. But she understood something important had changed. Not in the war, not in the city, but in the space between two groups of strangers who chose not to fear each other anymore. The peace they had found, however fragile, was not built to last. It was morning when the new officer arrived, Lieutenant Cooper, fresh-pressed and sharp-eyed, stepping out of a spotless jeep like a symbol of bureaucracy returned. His uniform bore no signs of war. His boots were polished, and his clipboard thick with regulations. The air changed around him. The soldiers who had shared food and laughter the night before now stood straighter, quieter, waiting for orders. Elsa noticed it immediately. The warmth that had begun to take root in the streets vanished like smoke. The soldiers stopped gathering near the children. The crates of supplies no longer appeared near the door. Paul asked why their soldier friends no longer smiled, and Helga stared silently at the cold fire pit that had been abandoned. Something had shifted, and the children didn't understand why. The next day, Sergeant Mills, who had once taught Kurt how to whistle, walked past their door without a glance. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the ground. Elsa called out softly, but he didn't stop.
That silence hurt more than any insult could have. It was the silence of men being ordered to forget their humanity. Lieutenant Cooper issued a new set of directives. No contact with German civilians. No distribution of food to unauthorized individuals. No personal exchanges or emotional involvement with non-military persons. The kindness of the past few weeks was dismissed as unprofessional fraternization. The soldiers were to remember their role, not as helpers, but as occupiers. Elsa overheard some of this through cracked windows and whispered conversations between guards. She heard arguments, quiet but intense. Some soldiers didn't agree, but their voices were smothered by the weight of command. Orders were orders, and orders, in wartime, did not care about small boys with drawings or girls with wildflowers. Helga asked Elsa if they had done something wrong. If the candy, the pictures, the bread had all been a mistake. Elsa couldn't answer. She simply hugged her daughter and whispered that not all things stay. But in her heart, she knew the truth was crueler. Sometimes kindness is allowed only until someone in power notices. That evening, Elsa saw two soldiers carrying away the wooden crates from the alley. One of them glanced toward her basement window. Their eyes met briefly. It was Private Reynolds, the one who had shared his own rations with Paul. He looked like he wanted to say something, but turned away instead. His hands were full of regulations now. Elsa felt the old wall rebuilding itself inside her, the one that had cracked when the Americans first arrived with bread and open palms. She hated that wall. It made her heart heavy. But survival had taught her how to live behind it. Trust had been a luxury, and she had almost believed they could afford it again. The worst part was watching the children's confusion. Kurt waited at the doorway with his empty cup every morning, hoping someone might come by. Paul sat drawing pictures he no longer delivered. Helga stopped braiding her hair. Elsa could see it in their eyes, the soft light dimming. They were retreating into silence again, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. 2 nights later, a knock came at the cellar door. It was soft, hesitant. Elsa opened it to find no one there, just a folded piece of cloth on the step. Inside was a chocolate bar and a note. "We didn't forget you." No name, no signature, just those 5 words. She held the note in her hands for a long time before placing it in the same tin where she kept her husband's last letter. The next morning, the checkpoint at the edge of the town was reinforced. New fences, new guards, no more exceptions. Elsa gathered her children close and told them not to go outside anymore. Helga didn't ask why. Paul just nodded. And Kurt stared out the window, holding his empty cup like a memory he didn't want to let go of. It was Elsa who made the decision to leave the cellar. The silence inside had grown unbearable, not just from hunger, but from the look in her children's eyes. Kurt no longer asked questions. Paul stopped drawing. Helga, once so protective of her brothers, now sat in the corner, her face turned to the wall. Elsa feared they would disappear into themselves before the war even ended. She dressed them in the cleanest clothes they had, which still smelled of mildew and smoke. With shaking hands, she tied Helga's hair back and washed Kurt's face with cold water. There was no more pride, only desperation. They would go to the American checkpoint and ask for help, whatever help meant now. Even a prison camp would be better than dying slowly in the dark. The streets were empty as they walked. Buildings loomed like skeletons, their windows hollow and broken. A soft wind stirred dust in the air, and every step echoed through the ruins. Elsa walked ahead, carrying a white cloth in her hand as a signal of surrender. Her heart pounded, but her face remained still. She had no room left for fear. When they reached the checkpoint, a soldier raised his hand to stop them. Elsa opened her mouth to speak, her practiced English phrases caught in her throat. But then someone called her name, Mrs. Berger, and the sound stopped her cold. She turned and saw a figure walking toward them, familiar and impossible at once. It was Private Reynolds, no longer in uniform, carrying a duffel bag and a piece of paper. He knelt in front of Kurt and handed him a wrapped package. "This is from someone who never forgot," he said quietly. Inside was a tin of peaches, a new bar of soap, a folded letter, and a drawing Kurt had once given him, returned now like treasure. Elsa's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded, as if to say, "I understand." Other soldiers began to appear. Some brought food, others stood silently, watching. One placed a pair of worn boots beside Paul's feet. Another handed Helga a wool scarf. No one spoke loudly. No one gave orders. They simply acted, quietly, reverently, like people trying to undo what the war had made them forget. Sergeant Mills arrived moments later, carrying a crate of supplies. He looked different, older somehow, or maybe just more tired. He handed Elsa a bowl of hot stew and said, "You're not alone." Those words, spoken plainly, broke something loose inside her. For the first time in weeks, she let herself believe they might live. Reynolds unfolded the letter he had brought. It was from his sister back home, written for Elsa and the children. It spoke of hope, of second chances, and of how war doesn't end when the guns go silent, but when people choose to see each other again. Helga read the words aloud in halting English, her voice cracking with every line. By the end, even the soldiers had tears in their eyes. Lieutenant Cooper emerged from the outpost, clipboard in hand. He saw the gathering and paused. For a moment, it seemed he might speak, might shut it all down again. But then his gaze fell on Kurt, who sat eating peaches like they were the most sacred thing in the world. Cooper lowered the clipboard and walked away without a word. That night, the cellar was warmer, not because of fire, but because of presence. The children fell asleep with full stomachs and quiet dreams. Elsa stayed awake for a while, watching their peaceful faces. The war still raged elsewhere, but in that small room, something had ended. Or maybe something had begun. The next morning, the sun rose through a gap in the wall, touching Kurt's face with soft light. He stirred, stretched, and looked at his mother. "Can we go outside again?" he asked. Elsa smiled faintly and said yes, not because it was safe, but because it was finally possible. And that possibility, born from shared bread and human hands, was more powerful than any weapon they had known.